You need to understand what we prepared for over a very long time, analyst Myra Castellan said to the empty office at 03:17 station time, the cursor blinking on her unfinished report. The weight of that sentence had more to do with the silence after it than the words themselves. 6 years. That's how long Earth's legal team had been building the case she was now watching collapse in real time. The chamber lights shifted from amber to deep red. When a room that old changes color, every decision has already been made. Not in that moment earlier, days earlier perhaps, weeks. The grand arbiter of the Galactic Council, a Velhari named Velsorthek, didn't pause as he read from a prepared document. No hesitation, no breath. Every sentence sequenced in advance of this very instant. When Ambassador Cale Thorne stood alone in front of 212 species delegations and watched the color change above his head, Thorne set his presentation pointer down without making a sound. That detail mattered. He folded his hands over his notes, listened. The annex of contemplation was 800 meters across, circular, its terrace walls holding the delegations of 212 species. Each section built to accommodate a different biology, a different gravity, a different arrangement of limbs. Some delegations sat in person, their bodies adapted to the chamber's temperature and atmosphere. Others rendered themselves as precision light field projections, detailed enough that you could read the expression on a face without knowing the body producing that face was decades of travel away. Myra had learned to spot the difference after 4 years by the faint delay in blinking. There was always a delay in blinking when the body wasn't there. Thorne was the only human in the room. He had been the only human in this room for 4 years. In that time, he had learned that 212 species watching you with varying degrees of open disdain was not actually as difficult to manage as it sounded, provided you had a clear objective in your head and something to do with your hands. The clear objective helped considerably. The folded hands helped more. The first charge was unauthorized resource extraction. Earth had established mining operations in 11 planetary bodies inside Council-mapped space without prior approval. The Council had sent formal notices. Earth's legal team had responded with arguments citing provisions in the Council's own founding charter that, when read carefully, did not prohibit what Earth was doing. The Council had sent more notices. Earth had sent more arguments. This exchange had continued for 3 years with neither side moving, circular, locked, predictable. The second charge was infrastructure interference. Earth's deep space relay network, described publicly as a navigation and research asset, had been positioned in a manner the Council claimed disrupted 3 established communication corridors. Earth's engineers had produced technical documentation demonstrating that the disruption fell below the threshold defined in Council Technical Standard 44G and therefore constituted no compliance violation. The Council had found this response more aggravating than the first charge. There was something about precise technical argument that seemed to irritate institutional bodies accustomed to authority rather than evidence. The third charge took the longest to read. The Council called it deliberate strategic ambiguity. They meant that Earth had for 3 decades refused to define the limits of its expansion, the ceiling of its military capacity, or the precise boundary of what it considered its own sovereign territory. Every Council request for a clear answer had received a qualified answer, technically accurate, perfectly legal, and giving away nothing. The Council had concluded correctly that this was deliberate policy, not accident, policy. Velsorthek finished reading. The final terms came in a voice that carried no variation of tone. Earth had 70 galactic hours to submit all military assets to full Council inspection. Earth was to provide complete disclosure of all exploration and development activity over the past 30 years. Earth must accept a formally negotiated ceiling on future expansion. Earth was required to provide written acknowledgement of the primacy of Council governance in all matters of galactic order. Failure to comply would result in the Council moving to direct enforcement. The room held still, not frozen, held. The difference was intention. 212 delegations understood that something large had shifted. The shift carried weight. Thorne looked at the ceiling of the annex, painted in the amber and deep orange of the Velhari home system. a choice made 8 centuries ago by the founders of the Council, the same founders who had written the charter that Earth's legal team had been citing in response to Council notices for the past 3 years. He looked back at Velsorthek. The Grand Arbiter had gone very pale, not afraid, pale in the way that meant hard decisions, compressed options, the color of institutional strain. Then Thorn spoke. "I have 3 questions." The shift in the room was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but present. The way that change in air pressure is present before a storm. Delegations that had settled into passive attention sharpened. Attention was no longer distributed, it was focused. Entirely. Thorn's hands remained folded. He did not look at the delegations. He looked at Velsorthek. A person who looks around a room while asking a difficult question is telling the room they are not entirely sure. Thorn had learned that 4 years ago. He was sure of himself. "First question," Thorn said. "The inspection of military assets. Is the Council's authority to require this derived from the membership charter or from the enforcement protocol?" Velsorthek's coloring shifted toward a darker shade. The Velhari expressed emotional states through pigmentation, a legacy of their biology that the Council's formal procedures had never quite managed to eliminate. "The enforcement protocol," Velsorthek said. "Which applies to member species?" Thorn asked. "Which applies to all civilizations within Council-mapped space," Velsorthek responded. Thorn paused. He let that contradiction breathe in the chamber. He did not point it out. He simply moved to the second question. "Second question. The expansion ceiling. Is it set by the Council alone, or does the process include a formal response period and negotiation from the target civilization?" Velsorthek hesitated, the first true hesitation in his reading. "The Council defines initial parameters. A response period follows." "Third question," Thorn said. The words were measured, each one given equal weight. "The acknowledgement of primacy. When you use the word acknowledge, do you mean legal recognition as a binding fact or a political declaration?" Silence, long enough to count. Myra, watching from the monitoring station in Geneva, counted 5 seconds. 5 seconds of silence in a formal session of this kind was profound. Velsorthek did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried something different, not anger, uncertainty. "These are procedural questions." "They are," Thorn agreed, "and they require clarification before I can deliver Earth's formal response. I need to contact my government." He paused. He looked directly at Velsorthek. "I need 4 hours." "You have 70 galactic hours," Velsorthek said. "I only need 4, Thorn said. "I know what they will say, I just need it said on the record." He gathered his tablet and his presentation documents. He stood up. The movement was unhurried, composed. He walked toward the main exit. The path took him along the chamber floor beneath the full height of the terrace delegations. 212 species watching a single human walk the length of the room at a pace that communicated nothing, except that he knew exactly where he was going and had no particular feelings about who was watching. He stepped into the outer corridor. White walls. Clean, permanent architecture built by a civilization that had not expected to encounter what was about to happen. He called Secretary General Carol Nand. She picked up immediately. "Tier 1 classification," Thorn said. 70 hours. Full inspection, expansion ceiling, primacy acknowledgement, and complete disclosure of all development activity for 30 years. He heard Carol exhale, not in fear, in the specific way of a person hearing the final confirmation of something they had been preparing for over a very long time. "Every item on the list," Carol said. "Every single one," Thorn confirmed. "Then we begin," Carol said. "Go back inside and hold your position. Do not offer anything. Do not signal anything. Let them wait for a surrender. 66 hours, Kale. Then you walk back in and deliver our answer." "What is our answer?" he asked. The line carried the sound of Carol's offices, the hum of systems, the particular acoustic signature of a place built to coordinate a civilization's response to something larger than itself. "It is not a surrender," Carol said. The line closed. Thorn stood in the white corridor of Velshan Station for a moment. He thought about the 22 ships positioned in the deep dark beyond Earth's solar system. He thought about the crews that had trained for this moment through 51 readiness drills and 8 live exercises, moving through council-monitored space without triggering a single query. He thought about 10 years of construction hidden in facilities that declared themselves as geological research stations. Then he turned around and walked back into the annex of contemplation. Somewhere on the far side of the solar system, aboard the Meridian, a vessel officially registered as GS 7741, a deep space geological survey craft carrying a crew of 14 and approximately 40 metric tons of drilling equipment, Commander Ree Garland was reading the same message that had just been transmitted through secure channels to all 22 ships of operation standing reply. The message was clear. The Galactic Council had issued a formal decree against Earth, Tier 1 classification, 70-hour compliance deadline. Operation Standing Reply was authorized. All 22 ships were to confirm activation within the hour and deploy at hour 68. Ree read the message once, then he read it again, not because the meaning was unclear, but because some documents carry enough weight that they deserve a second pass before you act on them. Some documents change things in ways that can't be walked back. The Meridian was 340 meters from stern to bow, constructed over 10 years in a facility on the far side of Callisto that rotated its workforce every 6 months. The hull carried coding that absorbed the electromagnetic frequencies used by Council identification sensors. The drives were calibrated to produce a power curve that matched a commercial freighter when running below capacity. 3 separate Council monitoring sweeps had processed her drive signature and classified her as a low-priority scientific asset. She was one of 22. Ree had commanded her for 3 years. In that time, he had run 51 readiness drills. He had navigated 8 live exercises through Council-monitored space without triggering a query. He had studied the tactical briefings for an operation that had no public name until 2 months ago, when the Secretary General's office had circulated a document referring to it as Operation Standing Reply. His communications officer, a careful and precise young woman named Fiona Hale, stepped onto the bridge. She said his name in the specific tone she reserved for information that required his immediate and undivided attention. "Commander." Ree set down the system's diagnostic tablet. He followed her to the communications station. The bridge was already staffed. His crew had developed over 3 years of preparation, a particular sensitivity to changed conditions, a recognition that didn't require explicit announcement to activate. Lieutenant Owen Pace was at the tactical station, his hands moving through pre-checks he had not been asked to run. Sergeant Carl Ames had the weapons board open and was running a quiet calibration he had performed so many times it was closer to habit than procedure. Navigator Petra Walsh had the jump calculation hold file up on her screen, the one Ree had asked her to keep ready for the past 48 hours. Ree read the activation signal on the primary screen. He read it once. He read it again. He turned to face his crew. They watched him with the readiness that years of preparation produces in people who take their work seriously. Not excitement, not manufactured calm. Simply the focused presence of people who have spent a long time getting ready for something and have just been told it has arrived. "You have been briefed on the operation parameters," Ree said. "The timeline has started. We deploy at hour 68. Until then, full readiness maintenance. All systems on standby warm. No signal traffic outside the secure channel. Questions can be asked now." Nobody asked questions. Carl Ames turned back to the weapons board and began running pre-activation sequences with the quiet speed of someone whose hands know the work better than their conscious mind does. Petra Walsh locked the jump coordinates into the navigation hold. Fiona opened the secure fleet channel to verify that all 22 ships had received the signal. Ree left the bridge. He walked the Meridian. This was his practice before every significant drill, not because mechanical faults needed checking, the diagnostic systems covered that, but because some things couldn't be reached by diagnostic systems. What he was checking for was readiness that went beyond preparation. What he found at every station was the same: crews that were not performing readiness, but simply doing the work of it in the specific manner of people who have been ready for a long time and are now in the last stretch before the thing they prepared for begins. He stopped in the engineering bay. Chief Engineer Pat Bellows was running a final calibration on the experimental close-range system. The official manifest listed it as a backup navigation array. The manifest was accurate as far as it went. Pat was the only person on the Meridian who held the full schematic. "Final status?" Ree asked. Pat looked up from her screen. Her expression was unchanged. "Better than the last drill. The interference pattern has extended by 8% across the target frequency range. Whatever targeting protocol their ships use to establish a lock, this should push the full recalibration time to somewhere between 35 and 50 seconds. Ree considered what 35 seconds meant inside a close engagement. That was an eternity. That was the difference between coordinated response and confused scrambling. "That is more than enough," he said. "I know," Pat said without drama. "That is why I built it to those parameters." Ree returned to his cabin. He slept 6 hours with the focused efficiency of a person who has learned that rest before an operation is not a comfort but a requirement. He woke at hour 50. He ran a final systems review with the full crew on the bridge. He spent the remaining hours in preparation that was quieter than any of the drills had been, because this was real and real things carry a particular texture that drills cannot reproduce. Back in Geneva, Myra Castellan was reviewing the industrial capacity question. She had been awake for 3 days. This was not unusual for her during significant events. She had been awake for 4 days during the initial first contact protocols, when the Council's first official transmission reached Earth's monitoring network, and 20 years of carefully managed non-response became permanently unsustainable. She had been awake for 3 days when Earth's legal team filed its first formal challenge to the Council's enforcement protocol application. Her assistant, a methodical young man named Ted Morse, had learned to bring coffee without being asked and to deliver urgent information in a tone that reached through exhaustion without startling, which is a harder skill than it sounds, which is something Myra valued more than she had ever told him. Myra was the director of strategic analysis at the UN Council Coordination Office. The office had existed for 18 years. Its official purpose was coordinating Earth's response to Galactic Council communications. Its actual purpose was understanding what the Council was actually capable of and comparing that against what it believed itself to be capable of. 2 different things, in ways that mattered enormously. She pulled up the file on her secondary monitor. The Council's intelligence operations on Earth had been extensive. 17 confirmed monitoring programs over the past 60 years. Within the boundaries of what they were looking for, the work had been thorough. The problem was what they had not thought to look for. Every spacefaring civilization in the Council's records had followed a common developmental pattern: consolidate the home system, establish primary infrastructure, expand outward in a declared and registered sequence, visible at every stage. They did this because the Council's framework rewarded declared development and restricted undeclared development, and every civilization that had joined the Council had naturally adopted that framework as their operational model. Earth had not joined the Council. Earth had received the Council's framework as a set of external restrictions imposed without consent. Earth had reviewed those restrictions carefully, and Earth had made a series of decisions that any industrial historian would recognize as entirely logical, and that the Council's analysts had apparently not modeled at all. Where the Council expected declared programs, Earth had built declared programs that were exactly what they appeared to be and nothing else. Where the Council expected registered vessels, Earth had registered exactly the vessels it was prepared to have known about. Where the Council expected transparent development, Earth had produced transparent development in the locations it knew were being monitored. Everywhere else, Earth had done something quite different. Ted brought her a new update. She read it without interrupting her analysis. The compliance fleet was operating at significantly reduced formation coherence. The experimental close-range systems on the 22 ships were performing above projected parameters. The fleet's recalibration time, was running longer than the worst-case estimate in their models, which meant either Pat Bellows' system was working better than designed, or the fleet equipment was older than their intelligence suggested, or both. Myra set the update down and went back to the industrial capacity question. That was the thread she needed to pull. The 22 ships were the visible part of the answer. They were what had been revealed today, and what would from this point forward be the center of the story this event produced. But the 22 ships were themselves the product of something much larger, something that had been running in parallel with Earth's official industrial activity for a very long time. Callisto had been the primary construction site for the frigate program. The facility there had been declared as a deep space geological research station. It had produced 18 years of research output that was real. The research division was real. It was staffed by people who had no clearance for the rest of the facility and did not know the rest existed. This required a level of operational compartmentalization that was genuinely difficult to sustain across years. The people who had sustained it deserved considerably more recognition than they would ever receive publicly. But Callisto was only one site. There were 11 others. The lunar facility had produced components. The Mars orbital platform had produced propulsion systems. 4 asteroid belt installations, all declared as mining operations, had produced raw materials processed to specific tolerances. The entire supply chain had been managed through a logistics network that, viewed from outside, looked like ordinary commercial traffic of a growing industrial civilization. Because it was ordinary commercial traffic, carrying real goods between real facilities, the goods simply not being the goods listed on the manifests, and the facilities not being only what they were declared to be. The Council's entire model of Earth's military capacity had been built from declared assets. The declared assets were real. They were in every case accurately recorded. They were simply not the complete picture. And the Council had assumed that a declared asset list from a civilization it was monitoring closely was a complete picture, because that was how every other civilization it monitored behaved. It was a reasonable assumption. It had never been wrong before. The problem with a reasonable assumption that has never been wrong is that you eventually stop testing it. Ted put a fresh coffee on Myra's desk. She thanked him and went back to the board. The Compliance Fleet Port Formation Squadron had lost structural coherence. 14 vessels had broken from assigned positions. 3 had initiated communication blackout protocols, which, according to the Council's own tactical manuals, was a procedure used when a vessel's command authority was uncertain. Myra wanted to be precise about this. In the documentation she was already drafting about this event, about what the 22 ships were actually doing, she would need precision, because the story would be told as a military confrontation, and the military framing would miss the most important element. The 22 ships were not trying to overpower the compliance fleet. They were doing something far more specific. They were making the fleet's command structure unable to function as a coordinated unit. There is a significant difference between defeating a force and making a force incoherent. Defeating a force requires matching or exceeding its total capacity. Making a force incoherent requires only disrupting its coordination. And coordination is the specific mechanism that converts individual vessels into an effective fleet. Pat Bellows' experimental system had not destroyed the compliance fleet targeting arrays. It had extended their recalibration time to the point where the synchronized engagement doctrine the fleet depended on could not be executed. Without the doctrine, the formation did not function. Without the formation, 340 vessels became 340 separate and uncoordinated problems rather than one organized threat. And the Council's fleet had never needed to operate outside its doctrine, because nothing in 8 centuries had required it to. The doctrine had always worked. That was both its great strength and its complete blind spot. Cale Thorne returned to the Annex of Contemplation with 2 hours and 40 minutes remaining on the deadline. The chamber was fuller than it had been during the decree reading. He had expected some thinning of attendance, species quietly withdrawing as the deadline approached, and the conclusion seemed inevitable. Instead, There were more projection feeds than usual, more physical delegations, more aides pressed into the upper observation galleries. A development large enough to affect 212 species had the same effect as a significant event in human politics. Everyone wanted to be present to see how it resolved. Thorn walked to the Earth delegation station, sat down, and set his tablet on the table without opening it. Grand Arbiter Velsorthek called the session to order. Ambassador Cole, Velsorthek said, the Council is prepared to receive Earth's formal response to the decree. The Earth delegation is prepared to deliver it, Thorn said. Velsorthek leaned forward slightly. Does Earth accept the terms as stated? The phrasing was precise. Not what is Earth's response, but does Earth accept? A question shaped to make the expected answer feel like the natural one. Earth does not accept the terms as stated, Thorn said. The room shifted. Not gradually. Immediately. 212 delegations received the same information at the same moment, and the collective effect of that many minds registering something unexpected had a physical quality. It moved through the chamber like a pressure change before weather. Then what is Earth's position? Velsorthek asked. His phrasing had moved off the formal template. The Grand Arbiter was improvising. Thorn opened his tablet. He read from it, not because he needed the text, but because reading from a physical record in a formal session carries a specific message. It says the words being spoken were written and approved through a deliberate process. It says this is not improvisation. It says the document exists and will continue to exist after this session ends. First, Thorn said, that Earth acknowledges every factual item in the decree. The resource operations were real. The relay network was positioned as described. The 3 decades of qualified responses to Council inquiries were deliberate policy. Earth does not dispute the record. He paused. The first pause was intentional. Second, that Earth rejects the legal framework applied to those facts. The enforcement protocol cited in the decree applies to civilizations that had agreed to Council governance. Earth had not agreed to Council governance. Earth had been placed within Council-mapped space, a designation applied unilaterally without Earth's participation, and had been subject to Council notices, restrictions, and ultimately a decree through no process in which Earth had ever had the opportunity to accept, decline, or negotiate the authority behind those instruments. Another pause, a longer one. Third, that Earth is prepared to negotiate a formal relationship based on equal standing, full membership with voting rights, access to Council information and infrastructure on the same terms as any other member species, legal recognition of Earth's sovereignty over its current and future development activities, retroactive to the date of first confirmed contact between human vessels and Council-monitored space. Thorn set the tablet down. That is Earth's response. Velsorthek did not speak immediately. Thorn counted 5 full seconds of silence, which was a long silence in a formal session of this kind. Ambassador Cole, Velsorthek said at last, you are aware that the Council's compliance fleet is positioned at the boundary of your solar system. I am aware, Thorn said, and that the 70-hour compliance deadline has now expired. It has, and that the Council's enforcement protocol provides for immediate action upon the expiration of a non-compliance deadline. I have read the protocol, Thorn said. I note that the protocol also provides for a suspension of enforcement action during active diplomatic engagement between a Council representative and a target civilization's official delegate. I am an official delegate. We are engaged diplomatically, unless the Council wishes to dispute that characterization. Velsorthek had gone very dark. The coloring was the deep shade that meant hard negotiation, compressed options. The color of institutional strain pushed to its limit. A delegation from the far left tier rose. It was a small species Thorn had identified as the Thurine, who occupied a single seat in the second level and had never spoken in any session Thorn had attended. Its translator was a device worn at the throat. The Thurine delegation, it said, in a voice that was quiet but carried cleanly in the silent room, requests clarification on the legal basis for the enforcement protocol's applicability to a civilization that has not ratified the membership charter. The room absorbed this. Another delegation raised its communication indicator. Velsorthek acknowledged it. The Orvan Collective, a multi-being species that shared a joint decision structure and spoke through a single designated voice. The Orvan delegation also requests clarification, specifically whether the Council holds a record of Earth having been offered formal membership prior to the issuance of enforcement directives. Thorn kept his expression neutral. He knew what these questions meant. He had been told through sources he would not name in this room that there were species in this council who had been waiting for a moment when the legal inconsistency in the enforcement protocol became impossible to ignore in an open session. The protocol had been applied selectively for decades to small civilizations with no capacity to contest it. The questions that should have been asked had not been asked because there was no incentive to ask them. The incentive had just arrived. Then the communications alert sounded, not from Thorn's equipment, from the Council's own monitoring network. The secondary display systems around the chamber flagged a significant change in the sensor data incoming from the boundary of Earth's solar system. The compliance fleet was no longer in formation. Thorn looked at the screens along with everyone else. The data was in the Council's own tactical notation, processed by the Council's own systems, unmodified by any human input. 22 unidentified vessels had appeared inside the compliance fleet formation boundary, not at the edge. Inside, well within the minimum safe distance that every Council tactical reference listed as an inviolable operational zone. The sensor returns on the unidentified vessels were inconsistent, cycling between several different classification types, which Thorn knew meant that Pat Bellow's experimental system was functioning exactly as designed. The compliance fleet was not responding in any coherent direction. Thorn watched the display with genuine attention, not to perform watching it, but because he wanted to understand what was happening. Then he looked back at Velsorthek. "Grand Arbiter," Thorn said, "I believe Earth's response is now complete in all its parts." Velsorthek was looking at the display screen with all four eyes fully open. In Velhari physiology, that was not a resting state. It was the expression of a being processing something for which no prepared response existed. The Cella's delegation rose. 600 years in the Council, and they had never once deviated from the Velhari majority. "The Cella's delegation," the delegate said carefully, "supports the request for clarification. We note that the Founding Charter's third article guarantee of consideration for eligible civilizations is not qualified by membership status. We believe Earth meets that definition and would like the record to reflect that this question has been formally raised." Velsorthek called for a procedural pause. Thorn accepted it with a slight nod. He settled back in his chair and waited. He thought about Ree Garland and 22 ships that had spent years being something other than what their registration said. He thought about 51 drills run in the dark. He thought about the particular quality of work that people do when they know the stakes are real and the preparation has to be complete. The gap between preparation and the moment it is needed always feels longer than it actually is. He had learned that 4 years ago. He was still learning it now. He was entirely prepared to keep waiting. The procedural pause lasted 22 hours. In those hours, the Council authorized its second reserve fleet, 720 vessels, the primary long-range enforcement capability, ordered to proceed to Earth's solar system at standard cruise, 41 hours out. The Council did not announce this publicly, but Earth's monitoring network had processed the authorization signal. Cale Thorn received the confirmation from Carol Nand 6 hours into the pause. He sat with that number for about 30 seconds, 720 vessels. Then he thought about Myra Castellan's analysis, the layers of preparation beneath what had just occurred, and the 30 seconds passed. He went back to work. He slept 4 hours with the focused efficiency of a person who understands that rest before a critical moment is not comfort, but requirement. He ate twice. He reviewed the Accord draft that Carol's legal team had been preparing for 3 years and updating continuously for the past 22 hours to reflect the legal questions raised on the chamber floor. The draft was detailed, specific, built on a legal foundation that had been researched and reinforced over years by people who understood that if this document was ever needed, it would be argued over by 212 species for a very long time. He walked into the annex with the latest version on his tablet. Several physical delegations had withdrawn to projection attendance or had reduced their projection fidelity. This was a political positioning signal. Species uncertain about which side of the outcome they wanted to be formally associated with were giving themselves room to adjust their stance later. But the Thurine delegate was still present in person. Small, pale, translator at its throat, in the same seat it had occupied for decades. The Orvan Collective's voice was present, the Cella's delegation was present, and the Farath, who had been council members for 3 centuries and who had never, in Thorn's 4 years of observation, registered any public position that was not in exact alignment with the Velhari majority, were present in person. Their delegate had arranged its communication indicators in the active position. That was a significant development. Velsorthek took the central position. Thorn took his seat. The Grand Arbiter looked across the chamber and then looked at Thorn. This session is reconvened. The Council has reviewed the situation at the outer system boundary. The compliance fleet is undergoing tactical reassessment. A long pause, because what that meant was, the Council's entire 800-year enforcement doctrine had been revealed as incomplete. The assumptions it was built on had been proven wrong in front of 212 witnesses. The Council's Second Reserve Fleet has been authorized for deployment. Thorn nodded once. The Council reaffirms the terms of the original decree. Earth has not met the compliance deadline. The enforcement process will proceed. The Earth delegation acknowledges the Council's position, Thorn said. The Earth delegation's position remains as stated in the formal reply delivered during the previous session. The Council does not accept Earth's stated position, Velsorthek said. I understand, Thorn said. I have a question. Velsorthek's coloring shifted. The Grand Arbiter was preparing to deal with something outside the prepared framework. Ask it, Velsorthek said. Thorn leaned forward slightly. Not a gesture of aggression, a gesture of clarity. He wanted to be heard. The Council's founding charter, in its original text, uses the phrase equal consideration for all civilizations capable of deep-range transit and deliberate interstellar communication. That language comes from the 3rd article, 2nd section. Earth has been capable of deep-range transit for 31 years. Earth has been capable of deliberate interstellar communication, by the Charter's definition, for longer than that. The Charter provides a guarantee of equal consideration. I am asking the Council formally, and on the record, whether that guarantee was extended to Earth at any point prior to the current session. The room was completely still. Velsorthek did not answer immediately. The silence stretched. Thorn did not break it. He simply waited. The Thurine delegate rose from its seat. The Thurine delegation has reviewed the Council's formal records and cannot locate any document in which the guarantee described in the Charter's 3rd article, 2nd section, was offered to or received by the Earth delegation. The Thurine delegation requests that this be formally clarified and entered into the session record. The Orvan voice followed without waiting to be recognized. The Orvan delegation notes the same absence and supports the Thurine request for clarification. We add that the 3rd article guarantee carries no membership prerequisite in its text. It applies to eligible civilizations. Whether Earth is eligible by the Charter's own definition is a factual question with an answer, and the Orvan delegation believes that answer is yes. The Cella's delegate spoke. The Cella's delegation supports the position of the Thurine and Orvan delegations. We note further that the enforcement protocol was applied to Earth before the 3rd article question was addressed. We wish to formally register concern about that sequence. Velsorthek received a private communication through the device at its wrist. Read it with no visible change of expression. Then the Farath delegate raised its indicator and waited to be recognized. Velsorthek acknowledged it. The Farath delegation has considered the legal questions raised across the past 2 sessions and has concluded that the Council's application of the enforcement protocol to Earth is inconsistent with the 3rd article guarantee in the founding charter. The Farath delegation wishes to formally register this conclusion on the session record. The Farath had been council members for 3 centuries. They had never once registered a formal dissent. Thorn kept his expression entirely neutral. What was happening in this room was not entirely the product of Earth's actions. The legal questions were real. They had always been real. Species that had never had a sufficient opening to raise them had held them for decades. Earth had provided that opening, but the frustration and the questions had existed long before Earth's ships appeared at the outer system boundary. The incentive had simply arrived. Velsorthek called for a second procedural suspension to allow for private consultations among the council's senior members. Thorn accepted it with the same nod he had used before, settled back in his chair, waited. The suspension lasted 9 hours. When it ended, Velsorthek returned to the central position with a formality that Thorn recognized immediately, the formality of someone who had arrived at a position through compromise rather than conviction. The coloring was pale, the Velhari state that followed hard internal negotiation, not defeat, not quite, but the particular emptied-out quality of a decision that cost something to reach. The Council, Velsorthek said, has agreed to enter into formal negotiations with the Earth delegation regarding the application of the Founding Charter's 3rd article to Earth status. Thorn looked at Velsorthek carefully. Precision mattered now. Words would be dissected by 212 species for decades. To be precise about the language, Thorn said, the Council is agreeing to negotiate Earth's membership under the 3rd article guarantee. Under the 3rd article, yes, Velsorthek said. The terms, including the retroactive question, remain subject to negotiation. The Earth delegation accepts that framework, Thorn said. We are prepared to begin immediately. The negotiations took 16 hours. They were the most demanding 16 hours Thorn had spent in 4 years on Velshan Station. Every clause in the Accord draft was argued. Every argument was conducted in the specific manner of people who understood that the document being written would be referenced by 212 species for a very long time. The precision of its language could not be recovered after the fact. Thorn's counterpart in the negotiations was not Velsorthek, but the Council's chief legal architect, a Velhari named Toth, somewhere in the vicinity of 250 years old. Toth had the quality of a mind that had been engaged in careful argument for most of a very long time and found it not exhausting but clarifying. Thorn respected Toth considerably. Toth argued honestly from the text, from the precedent without posturing. When Thorn made a point that was correct, Toth acknowledged it without resistance and moved to the next issue. When Toth made a point that was correct, Thorn did the same. They did not agree on everything. The retroactive clause was reduced in scope. The implementation timeline for several equal-standing provisions was extended. The resource extraction operations would require a joint review process rather than immediate full authorization. Thorn had modeled these compromises in advance. He accepted what he had planned to accept and held what he had planned to hold. When the final text was confirmed, the core of every position Earth had stated in its formal reply was intact: full membership with voting rights, legal recognition of sovereignty over current development activities, no inspection of military assets, no expansion ceiling, no primacy acknowledgement. Everything that mattered was in the document. The Accord of Equal Standing was signed at 18 minutes past midnight station time. Thorn signed for Earth. Velsorthek signed for the Council. 7 additional delegations led by the Thurine, the Orvan, the Sellas, and the Farath added their formal support registrations to the session record for inclusion as an appendix. Thorn sat back and looked at the document on his tablet. 12 pages of dense legal text in 17 simultaneous formats. In the most direct terms he could find, it was an acknowledgement that Earth existed and mattered, and would be treated accordingly by the oldest governance structure in the known galaxy. That was what 6 years had been for. Velsorthek stepped down from the platform and crossed the chamber floor. Thorn stood up. They stood at approximately equal height because the Earth delegation station floor was slightly elevated relative to the main floor, an arrangement Thorn had made 4 years ago and had never mentioned. Ambassador Cole, Velsorthek said, The coloring had settled into a mid-range shade. "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead," Thorn said. "The ships, they were built over years without disclosure. All of this was prepared long in advance of any decree." "Yes." "Then you knew this moment was coming." Thorn thought about how to answer that honestly. The pause was intentional, not hesitation, consideration. We did not know the decree would come at this specific time. We did not know its exact form, but we understood the general direction events were moving. He paused again. "We have a long history of understanding that things are moving toward a point before they arrive there. It is a skill that develops through repetition, and we have had considerable repetition. And the preparations, were they made because your species wanted this confrontation?" "No," Thorn said without hesitation. "They were made because we did not want to reach a confrontation unprepared. We did not know how this would end. We prepared so that it could end well regardless of the path it took, so that we would still be standing and arguing at the end of it." He paused. "We are very committed to still being standing and arguing." Velsorthek's coloring shifted slowly through several shades. "We made significant errors in our assessment of your species." "You made one significant error," Thorn said. "You looked at what we declared and assumed it represented the whole of what we were. We never told you it was the whole. You assumed." A long pause. "That," Velsorthek said, "is a fair statement." Thorn looked around the chamber. Most delegations were still present. The room carried the atmosphere of a space where something had been completed, not the end of a crisis. The end of a process that had a clear beginning and had now arrived at a resolution that would be argued about for decades. He was glad to have been here for it. He was also genuinely ready to go home. "Grand Arbiter," Thorn said, "I have one more question, and this one is personal." Velsorthek's 4 eyes focused on him fully. "What do you think comes next? Between your council and my species, what do you actually believe happens now?" Velsorthek was quiet for a moment. The coloring moved through several slow shades. The progression was almost meditative. The Grand Arbiter was not hesitating, processing. "I think we will argue," Velsorthek said at last, "considerably, and for a long time, about the meaning of clauses in documents we have just written, about boundaries, about resources, about the pace and limit of your expansion. I think your species will push every provision we have agreed to as far as its language permits. And I think we will push back, and I think the result will be neither exactly what your species wanted nor what ours expected, and I think it will nonetheless be better than where we were this morning." Thorn looked at Velsorthek. "That," he said, "is the most accurate prediction anyone has made about us in 4 years." Something moved through Velsorthek's coloring. Not laughter exactly, in the direction that laughter lives. The small involuntary acknowledgement that 2 very different beings have for a moment understood each other without needing the words to be more precise. "Perhaps," Velsorthek said, "we understand each other slightly better now than we did at the start of this session." "Slightly," Thorn said. "It is a start." He picked up his tablet, tucked it under his arm, and walked the length of the annex of contemplation one final time, past 212 delegations, through the main entrance, out into the corridor. He called Carol Nand. She answered before the first signal ended. "It is signed," Thorn said. "Full membership, 3rd article basis. Voting rights, sovereignty recognition, no inspection clause, no expansion ceiling, no primacy acknowledgement." Silence just for a moment. "Everything," Carol said. "Everything," Thorn said. He heard her exhale. Behind her, the sound of the operations floor registering the news. The particular sound of a room full of people releasing something they had been carrying for a very long time. "Come home," Carol said. "I am on my way," Thorn said. He stood in the white corridor of Velschen Station for a moment after the call ended. In the annex of contemplation behind him, 212 species were doing what they always did after a significant session, conferring, calculating, beginning the long work of adjusting to a change in the structure of the world they shared. Somewhere in the outer solar system, 22 ships that had spent years being something other than what their registrations described were ending an engagement with a fleet that had not expected to need to end an engagement in 8 centuries. Somewhere in Geneva, Myra Castellan was updating her analysis log. Ted Morse was making coffee. Thorne thought about the document he had just signed, about the children who would grow up in a world where that document was already history, where the argument for Earth's seat at the table was something that had already been settled before they were born, where the starting point was already somewhere further forward than where he had spent 6 years working toward. He thought about his grandfather, who had looked at the night sky from a farmhouse in Cornwall and told a 10-year-old Cale that everything up there was either waiting to be found or waiting to find us, and that either way, the correct response was to be ready. They had been ready, not because they had been certain of the outcome. He wanted to be clear about that in his own accounting because certainty and readiness are different things. Confusing them is a mistake that leads to bad preparation. They had not been certain, they had been thorough, patient, unwilling to accept the ceiling that someone else had decided should be placed over them, and they had kept working at the problem until the problem became something they could answer. He walked toward the transit bay, toward the shuttle, toward the long journey home, through a station that had been built by a civilization that had not expected him to last long enough to reach this corridor, and who would now, by the document he had just signed, have to make a permanent place in their framework for a species that had no intention of being quiet about it. He thought they would manage. He thought given time and sufficient argument, they might even find it interesting. The transit bay was ahead. Through its windows, the stars of the Velhari system were visible, sharp and cold and ancient, the same stars that had been visible through the ceiling of the Annex of Contemplation, watching every decision made in that room as the architects intended. Thorne looked at them for a moment. He had spent 4 years in a building designed to make those stars feel like witnesses to something enormous and permanent. He had found them impressive in his first session and grown accustomed to them over the following years until they were simply part of the room. Looking at them now, from the corridor, through the transit bay window, on the far side of a signed document that had taken 6 years and a great deal of effort and no small amount of hidden shipbuilding to produce, he found them impressive again. He stood there, hand reaching for the compass in his pocket. For the first time in 6 years, he pulled it out. The brass was worn smooth from decades of hands before him. The needle pointed in the direction that mattered, toward home. It always did. For the first time in 6 years, he let it. The shuttle carried him away from Velshan Station. The journey home would take weeks. Time enough to sleep. Time enough to think about what came next. Time enough to watch Earth grow larger on the screens until it was no longer a point in the black but a world. His world, with all its complications and arguments and futures still to be written. 16 months later, Cale Thorne stood in Earth's Council delegation office on Velshan Station for the first time as a voting member. The accord of equal standing hung on the wall behind his desk. 12 pages. 17 formats. The signature of the Galactic Council's Grand Arbiter and his own. The compass sat on his desk, where he had placed it the first day. He picked it up. The needle no longer pointed toward home. It spun slightly, settled, pointed again toward the window and the stars beyond. Home, it turned out, could be anywhere.